This is ego-utilitarianism, and this is my presentation of the positive definition of property, or the exclusion criterion of property. It's also a critique on property rights. Okay, so the positive definition of property, and when I say positive, I mean what is versus normative, what should be. Okay, so I claim that by defining property positively, or what property is, and applying it, you can actually get more desirable outcomes than just declaring something as a property right. And the only criterion I use to describe what is property is the exclusion criterion. So let me get to it. Okay, so definitions. To own an object is to be able to exclude the object from others. Okay, so the only criterion, the only thing that needs to be met is your ability to exclude others from the good, from the object. Don't want to restrict the object to a good, but it's the same analysis. Okay, property, any object that is owned, right? So it refers to the first definition. So any object that you can exclude others from, that you are able to exclude others from. So you can see this definition accounts for renting. To be able to, so if you rent something out, your ability to exclude him from further use due to non-payment of a rental fee or whatever, what have you, that determines if it's still your property or not. So if you rent something out and you can't get it back, it becomes his property. Now, again, this is a positive definition. I'm not saying what should be. So don't let your emotions get to you and say it's wrong to do so. Okay, because I'm not saying what's wrong or right. I'm just saying what is. Okay, so property is a monopoly or a monopsony using the exclusion criteria, right? In order to exclude others, it's like you're the sole user. I'm not sure if there's any Greek root word that in etymology I can use, mono user, right? So given that you're you can make it that such that you can have sole access to that object, makes it your property. So in a way, it's like a monopoly or monopsony, and it inherits a lot of the characteristics of a monopoly, and I'll get into this later, because property is dependent on how specifically you define the object. It's the same for a monopoly and monopsony, right? The more special, or the more you define an object, or in the case of a monopoly, a good, it's easier to label it a monopoly. Same thing with property, and I'll get into that later. So let me give you a quick example. Like in a monopoly, it's dependent on how specifically you define an industry for a monopoly. Like you can say the mobile phone market, which is kind of general. And then if I were to define that further, like iPhones, right? That's a more specific, that's a very specific subset of the mobile phone market. And just if I describe the industry, if the industry under consideration is the iPhone, I've necessarily can label that a monopoly just because I've specifically defined a good, right? An industry in this case. Okay, so here's an example using the positive definition of property. Again, this is not a moral claim, right? So I'm not saying what should be property. If someone steals something from you, they can further exclude you from it, a transfer of ownership takes place and it becomes the thief's property. So you can see that just applying this definition, it's logically consistent. It may not be to your liking, but it's a positive definition. It makes no sense, like in a two-man room, if I should steal like a piece of food from you, and you couldn't get it back, right? I can exclude you from it, and I'm eating it in front of your face. It makes no sense for you to keep telling me it's your property while I'm chugging it down and digesting it, right? So you see how it works in a positive sense, or what actually is. Okay, so let me criticize property rights. Property rights, on the other hand, is a normative definition of what property should be, right, in contrast to what is, right? Normative claims are derived from well-defined objectives, right? So you give me a well-defined objective, and a perfectly omniscient individual can tell you what you should do, or at least an enlightened person can tell you what you should do. Like if you tell me your goal or your objective is to get to a point the fastest way possible, um, you know, given a method of transportation, you know the pathway mathematically is a straight line. So you see how what you should take a straight line path, or if you're on the surface of the Earth, you know, to compensate for that, a curved path or whatever. But you can see how just give yourself given a well-defined objective, the pathway, the optimum pathway is defined, whether someone knows it or not. It's objectively there, right? Um, so so that's what I claim. No, so this is in direct contrast to Hume's law, or Hume's guillotine or something, because I claim that all shoulds are have to be derived from ises, because shoulds come from reality, or objective reality. And again, if your objective is, then you should. That always pertains to any ought, right? Comes from objectives. Okay, so rights should be rejected because you're projecting you're projecting your goals onto others. If your objectives align, if your goals align with the other person, there will be mutual exchange or trade, right? You don't have to declare something right or wrong. If the other guy feels that way, he'll agree with you, and you guys will make a pact or trade, or trade. Someone will pay someone else to do something for them. So rights are a vestige. They're like the residue of religious and government indoctrination, right? Religion tells you God gives you natural rights. Government tells you you have the right to this, the right to that, right to free speech, the right to pursue happiness. No, I claim no. All actions, all states, they must be earned. There's a cost to everything, and it must be paid by whoever wants to own them. That especially pertains to property. Okay, so rights are a claim, or worse, an entitlement. No claim is valid unless there is an enforceable contract. Right. So notice I emphasize enforceable here. If there's a contract and the other guy has no reason to fulfill it, just an empty promise, it's useless, right? You still have the burden of excluding the other person, the thief, from your property, or whatever situation you might be facing. You can't expect others to enforce your claim. That's an implicit contract. All contracts in a free market must be explicit, right? Entitlements are associated with welfare programs of governments or gods, right? So if rights are an entitlement, what you're entitled to, it's just from your indoctrination from grade school, all those documents you learned about, all the rights given to you or granted to you by gods, they're all vestiges of this. And if you're a logical individual, you should just put it aside, try out my positive definition of property, and see what it actually logically leads to. And I claim that it's just as desirable as rights, except you're not invoking morality by declaration. Okay, so property rights don't account for the cost of excluding people from that object. So people who believe in rights want to impose an outcome that is desirable from them. Rights are just a projection of your self-interest on the rest of society, right? So like when you homestead an object, you wouldn't have homesteaded if you didn't want it. So, but it would be nice that you didn't have to defend it yourself. So it's like you're delegating this cost. You're imposing this cost on the rest of society when you invoke rights, and you can't do that in a free market, or if you believe in a free market. Homesteading is inadequate. Again, it does not take into account the cost of excluding or defending property, or worse, invokes an implicit contract for others to do it for you, or vice versa, right? I mean, you wouldn't want someone else to invoke, hey, you got to defend my property from this thief here. You're not going to do it unless there's some interest for you, right? If it's your neighbor, you guys are going to naturally probably want to defend each other's property, because when you're not home and your neighbor's home, there's some comparative advantage there, where there's possibility for an explicit contract be made, where actual consideration, or something of value is given up from both parties in order for there to be mutual, for it to be mutually beneficial. You can't expect, you got to try to transcend the indoctrination you got from grade school, and put yourself on do Caruso in economics on a two-man island. Just a thief. You can't just yell, hey man, it's my right. I expect the island to defend me, or God to defend me, or defend my property for me. No, homesteading does not give you a magical right to something. It's a sunk cost. Whatever labor you put into that object, or any development you put into that object, is a sunk cost. You should not consider it as far as at the moment if you should defend or not, right? It makes no difference if you find an item that's been labored, that's exactly the same as the one you put labor into. If it's superior, you put all your resources into defending that instead of the thing you made. So homesteading is a sunk cost. It should be of no consideration as far as after you've homesteaded it. As far as a prospective homesteading, yeah. Before you homestead an object, you better be sure you can defend it after you've homesteaded it. So in that case, it would be pertinent or relevant. Okay, so rights mean nothing in a two-man room. Caruso economics, right? On a two-man, you just do thought experiments. And when one guy on an island is wanting to steal something from another, it doesn't make sense to just scream, it's your right, that's your right to have that object, just because you've homesteaded or whatever. It only makes sense when there's a society and you're just complaining to society to help you get the object back, and you're just projecting your self-interest on others. So it doesn't make any logic. It's not consistent, at least logically. A normative definition of property should only be of concern when describing the terms of an explicit contract. So the only time you should talk about what should or shouldn't be is when you're discussing the terms of a contract between maybe mutually defending each other's property, or hiring someone else to exclude others from your property for you, right? That's only a relevance that normative claims should come into work. Normative claims should come into play, because only once an explicit contract has been drawn out that you have a claim to something. And if the person who's actually fulfilling the end of excluding others from your property, if he has any interest in maintaining his reputation for making future contracts, he'll fulfill it, right? It's a simple game theory thought experiment, and we'll do one of those a little later. So I claim you can reach desirable outcomes using positive analysis, using my positive definition of property, instead of invoking magical rights, right? So with a positive definition, you can apply simple game theory thought experiments once an objective or goal of and self-interest and maximization of profit is applied. Property, and I claim property from this game theory will show that property will tend to flow to those who can best utilize it. So let's do a simple thought experiment, right? So let's take two individuals, one who has an object in his possession, And so let's say he can utilize it and extract certain amount of revenue from the object. Let's say 10 units of revenue, $10, let's say. And there's another guy who can better utilize the good at $20. So you can see the preconditions, the necessary preconditions to set up a mutually beneficial transaction, right? Even if so, any price in between 20 and 10 will be mutually beneficial for each party to trade to turn over property of the good to the guy who can utilize it better. So let's say they'll agree to, if their negotiating power is the same, they'll agree to a price of 15, right? What is that called? The standard bargaining solution. If the negotiating power between two parties is the same, it'll be exactly the midpoint between the two values, 20 and 10, 15, 20 plus 10 divided by 2. So, all else equal, it'll still be in somewhere in between 20, even if it's not, the bargaining power is not the same. It'll still be in between, and both parties will still be mutually beneficial, no matter what point you choose in between 20 and 10. And that's what causes desirable outcomes. This simple game theory thought experiment. All property will tend to flow where it's best utilized, and this will happen with numerous objects, almost an infinite amount of objects with an infinite amount of players, right? And all these players will tend to cooperate with each other to defend each other's property, and then you'll get some semblance of a society, and a free market society, right? So exclusion is a cost. It's a task. It's a cost to owning property. You have to consider all costs and benefits when you choose to own something. And by invoking rights, it totally delegates the cost to the rest of society. And that's a game played by statists, right? Dispersing costs and concentrating benefits. And you can't invoke this. You can't invoke rights if you want to be a logically consistent libertarian. At least I claim, if you believe my argument, right? You must meet these costs, and it cannot be delegated to others without an exchange of valid consideration for a contract. But even with a contract, your ability to exclude others will depend on if you can enforce the contract. That is why contracts are irrelevant, because the criterion must be met. The exclusion criterion must be met, regardless if there's a contract or not, right? You still have to be able to enforce the contract. So ultimately, the responsibility still lies with you to satisfy the exclusion criterion. I mean, whether or not the other party, if you've hired someone else to defend your property for you, you still have to make sure they enforce it. They fulfill their end of the contract. So again, ultimately, it's up to you in a free market, right? Two-man island should make it. This makes sense in a two-man room or two-man island, and it still makes sense in society. It's just that you'll contract with others who have a comparative advantage to defend property. And so you see, this is all consistent with a free market, and rights aren't, right? It's a vestige of your indoctrination. So if it is profitable, you will do so, meaning you'll defend your property, or you'll pay someone else to do it for you, right? You're always the first line of defense, or the primary line of defense, and your second line of defense is the market, to hire someone else who can better do it for you. And reputation plays a game there, because everything's a repeated game, right? I mean, if you hire somebody and they do a bad job, you can affect their reputation, and therefore, good companies don't survive on bad reputations in the long run. One should seek a logically consistent positive definition of what property is, and apply analysis. Contracts are irrelevant to property in the positive sense. So again, ultimately, it's your responsibility. Again, contracts must be enforceable, meaning the burden of exclusion is still ultimately the current owner. So it's just reiterating the same thing. If you fail to satisfy the criteria of excluding others from that object, then it's not your property. Okay, so let's see how the positive definition applies to intellectual property. And by intellectual property or IP, I don't mean the laws currently that are currently in effect from government, right? Not IP law. I'm talking about intellectual property or ideas, the object of ideas. Okay, so rivalry is dependent on how specifically you define the object. So just like monopoly, if you specifically define an industry, you necessarily make it more likely to be to classify it as a monopoly. And in this case, if you specifically define an object, it actually necessarily becomes property, right? So so by specifically defining a non-rivalrous good, you can make it rivalrous, right? So if the non-rivalrous good is something like sunlight, if you consider just location, all location cannot be occupied by two objects at the same time, right? It's kind of common sense. But when you give a location coordinate with respect to the sunshine, if you just broadly define it as sunshine, it becomes non-rivalrous. But now that you've specifically defined it sunshine at this location, it becomes rivalrous. So it's a weird effect that definition can play a part on how you classify things based. So you got to be careful as far as applying this the idea of positive property, or the positive definition of property, at least the exclusion criterion, right? So an idea is difficult to exclude others from. So let's take the case of just idea. It's difficult to exclude others from due to independent thought or discovery and dissemination. But you define it as the idea. If you define it as the idea in your head, by default, it's both excludable and it becomes property, right? I mean, so if you define the object as, in general, a particular idea or a method of how, or technology of how to do something, it's very difficult to exclude others from it. So it's very expensive to maintain it as property, to own it, to exclusively own it, which is the exclusion criterion of own in the way I use it. Because of independent thought, someone else could just think of it independently, and or discovery, and once it's disseminated, once another person knows it, it becomes exponentially harder to exclude others from it, right? If this guy chooses to, even if you make a contract with a guy, if the guy accidentally leaves it out and someone copies it or whatever, this idea, it becomes almost impossible to contain at that point. So you can see with the positive definition of property, ideas are very hard, at least in general, if it's a general idea, which is what the concern is when libertarians talk about intellectual property. It's impossible. It's virtually too expensive to maintain as property or a monopoly. You can only do this with government, right? I think I'll say that. But if you define it as an idea in your head, if you specifically define it as that idea in your head, it has to be property, right? Because it's easy to exclude others from that same idea because it's in your head. Remember, it has a position coordinate in your head. So it's easy to exclude others from it. But if you're talking about just the general idea, it's virtually impossible. And in this case, you see that it's unprofitable to maintain a general idea as property. IP is only possible in the long run with government. Remember, it's very expensive to do so. So in the long run, someone will discover it, disseminate it, independently come up with it, and disseminate it. And you can't stop them from disseminating it unless you have government to do it for you, because violence is very expensive. So that's one of the reasons why I think government's short-term, I don't want to say short-term phenomenon, but it's unsustainable. It'll collapse in of itself because of the the actions it undertakes. They're not profitable, including defending IP. So people created this IP law so to delegate the cost to the government so that they could make owning an idea profitable. And so I claim the positive definition is consistent with the free market. So, and it brings about, it, it shows how IP can collapse in and of itself, or trying to make ideas property by the sole exclusion criteria. So yeah, just this definition here, the distinction between thought and concept. So the concept is like the general idea. The thought is actually includes the concept with an additional location criterion or coordinate, right, in your head. A thought is that it has a location in someone's head, but a concept is just the general idea itself with no location coordinate. Not in any one particular mind, just that it exists. Okay, so that's my presentation of the positive definition of property. I claim if you're a libertarian, you should adopt this perspective rather than rights. You should abandon rights because that's just a vestige of your government indoctrination or religious indoctrination. If you have any thoughts or comments or criticisms, leave them in the comments below. Like, comment, subscribe. Please present well thought out criticisms if you have any. And thank you for watching. This has been ego utilitarianism.